The cold wind howled through the empty fields as Ethan Cole rode his horse toward the ranch. The night had fallen heavy, and snowflakes spun in the air like tiny sparks from the white sky. The trail ahead was barely visible, covered in ice and shadow. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, his gloved hand firm on the reins. It was one of those nights when the world felt silent, like even the earth was holding its breath. He had been away for 2 days, taking supplies from the nearest town, and all he wanted now was the warmth of his cabin and a fire strong enough to chase away the cold. As he passed the frozen creek, something caught his eye. It was small and dark, lying near the bank where the snow had drifted. At first he thought it was a broken sack or maybe an animal that had fallen, but when his horse neighed and refused to move forward, Ethan knew something wasn't right. He dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching through the ice. The wind carried a low sound, faint, like a weak breath. He knelt down, brushed away the snow, and froze. Beneath the torn blanket was a young girl, her face pale and her lips trembling. Her clothes were thin, made of rough fabric and beads, and her feet were bare against the frost. She looked up weakly, her eyes dark and full of fear. Ethan could see she wasn't from the nearby towns. Her hair was braided with small feathers and colored threads, a tribal sign he had seen only from a distance before. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "You're freezing." The girl didn't answer. She tried to speak, but only a rough sound came out. Ethan quickly took off his coat and wrapped it around her small shoulders. Her body was shivering so hard that he could feel the tremors through the thick fabric. He looked around. There were no other signs of people, no footprints except hers. She must have been out here alone for hours, maybe all night. He lifted her carefully and carried her to his horse. She was so light it felt like carrying a bundle of sticks. Her head rested against his shoulder and he could feel her uneven breathing. Mounting his horse with one arm was hard, but he managed. The snow grew heavier as he rode back to the ranch, each gust cutting across his face like shards of glass. He kept whispering to the girl, hoping the sound of his voice would keep her awake. When the cabin came into sight, Ethan felt a wave of relief. He pushed the door open with his boot and hurried inside, the heat from the dying fire touching his frozen hands. He laid her gently near the hearth, throwing more wood onto the flames until the fire roared back to life. The girl's eyes fluttered open for a second, and she whispered something he couldn't understand, words from a language long before his time. Ethan boiled water, poured it into a tin cup, and held it near her lips. She drank slowly, her eyes darting around the small cabin. She seemed frightened, unsure if he was a friend or another kind of danger. "It's all right," Ethan said quietly. "You're safe here." The girl didn't answer, but looked at him with strange curiosity, as if trying to read his face. Her skin was rough from wind and cold, her hands marked with small scars and old burns. She couldn't be older than 16. Ethan wondered where her family was, why she had been left out in the storm. After she drank, he gave her a bowl of soup, plain but hot. She ate with slow movements, each spoonful trembling in her hand. When she finished, she looked toward the window where the snow still fell outside. Then she said a single word, soft and clear. "Naya." Ethan nodded slowly, realizing it was her name. He pointed to himself. "Ethan." Her lips moved around the name like she was testing it, and then she gave a tiny nod. It was the first time she seemed a little less afraid. Hours passed before she fell asleep. Ethan sat near the door watching the fire crackle. The orange glow flickered over the log walls and the tools hanging above the stove. Outside the storm screamed, but inside there was only warmth and silence. Still he couldn't rest. Something about the girl's sudden appearance bothered him. The tribal lands were several miles north, and people didn't usually cross them, not since the old border disputes. Ethan thought about riding to town in the morning to ask the sheriff for help, but something in him stopped. The way Naya had looked at him, trusting him even for a moment, made it hard to think about handing her over to anyone. She was just a scared child, lost in a world too cold for mercy. Around midnight, he heard her whispering in her sleep. Her words were soft but full of fear, like she was speaking to someone far away. Ethan didn't understand a word, but the tone chilled him. It sounded like a plea. He tossed another log into the fire and leaned back in his chair, listening to the storm calm outside. In the faint light, he noticed something around her neck, a small pouch tied with a strip of hide. It looked old, handmade, decorated with symbols burned into the leather. He didn't touch it, but he knew it meant something important. Maybe that was why she had been out there. Maybe someone had been chasing her for it. Ethan stayed awake until the first hint of dawn. When the snow finally stopped, he opened the door and looked out over the white land. The world was still clean and endless. He felt a strange pull in his chest, something between fear and purpose. He had lived alone for years, ever since his father passed and the ranch became his only companion. But now, inside that small cabin was someone who had survived the cold when she shouldn't have. When he turned back, Naya was sitting up, her blanket wrapped tight. Her eyes met his, and though she didn't speak, she nodded once. A quiet thank you from a world he didn't understand. Ethan smiled slightly. You rest. We'll figure this out in the morning. She didn't answer, but her gaze followed him as he moved around the cabin. Outside, the pale sun broke through the clouds, painting the snow in gold. Ethan didn't know it then, but the night he found Naya was only the beginning. By the next day, the peace of his lonely ranch would shatter, and the ground around his cabin would burn with a strange light, a perfect circle of fire that no one could explain. That morning, though, everything was calm. Just the crackle of the fire, the slow breath of a sleeping girl, and a man wondering why helping her felt like the start of something he could never walk away from. The sun climbed over the snow-covered hills as the ranch slowly woke to another day. Ethan Cole stepped outside, the cold air biting his face, but his mind was still on the girl sleeping near his fireplace. He had found her in the snow the night before, half frozen and alone. The memory of that night still felt unreal, how she had opened her eyes and whispered her name. Naya. He had seen fear in her face, but also something else, something that made him feel like he couldn't turn away. He walked to the barn, his boots crunching in the frost. The horses were restless, stamping their hooves as if they had sensed something strange in the air. Ethan gave them feed and checked the fences, trying to quiet the unease that had followed him since last night. Every few minutes he looked toward the cabin, wondering if Naya had woken. When he went back inside, she was sitting near the fire, wrapped in a blanket. The morning light fell softly on her face. She looked cleaner now, her hair unbraided, but her eyes were still distant. She stared at the flames like she was seeing memories burn there. Ethan smiled kindly. Morning, Naya, he said. She looked up, then gave a small nod. Her lips moved, repeating his word carefully. Morning. It was quiet, unsure, but it made Ethan's heart lift a little. He poured her a cup of tea and set it beside her. She looked at it first, then at him as if waiting for permission. When he nodded, she took it with both hands, sipping slowly. He could tell she was trying to be polite, though she didn't understand much of what he said. Ethan pointed toward the window, then himself. Work, he said, pretending to swing a hammer. Then he pointed at her in the fire. You rest. Stay warm. Naya watched him, confused at first, then smiled faintly when she understood. Rest, she repeated, her voice soft but clearer this time. Ethan went back outside. The air had grown heavy and still, and the forest beyond the ranch seemed unusually quiet. As he checked the fences along the east line, something caught his eye. Footprints. They weren't his, and they weren't from boots. They were barefoot, pressed into the snow, leading from the woods toward the edge of his field. He knelt down to look closer. The snow around the prints was melted slightly, as if they'd been made not long ago. He followed them a few yards, then stopped when he saw more, faint marks of hooves near the same trail. Horses, not wild ones either. Someone had been here during the night. Ethan felt a cold unease climb his spine. He turned back toward the cabin and saw smoke from the chimney curling into the air. Naya was still inside. He wanted to believe the prints meant nothing, maybe travelers or hunters passing through. But deep down he knew better. By noon, clouds began to roll in. Ethan brought in firewood and made lunch. Naya was sitting by the window, staring out at the forest. When he stepped inside, she pointed out the window and said something in her own language. Her tone was sharp, like a warning. Ethan set down the pot and walked over. What is it? He asked softly. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered a word he couldn't understand, but her eyes were full of fear. Then she turned to him, shaking her head quickly. No forest, she said. He nodded slowly, not sure what she meant. She looked like she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. She touched the pouch hanging around her neck, gripping it tightly. The gesture was protective, like a person holding on to their only link to safety. For a moment, their eyes met, and Ethan saw something that made his chest tighten. Not fear of him, but fear for him. The day grew quieter after that. Ethan worked in the barn while Naya helped in small ways, sweeping the floor, feeding the dog, folding the blankets. She didn't speak much, but every so often she would hum softly, a strange tune that sounded old, like it belonged to the mountains themselves. When the evening came, the sky turned a deep orange and the snow reflected the fading light like molten gold. Ethan stood by the fence again, looking at the forest line. For the first time, he noticed something unusual, a faint wisp of smoke rising far off beyond the ridge. He squinted, but the wind carried it away. He didn't like the feeling it gave him. He walked back inside and bolted the door. Naya looked at him as he did, her eyes serious. She said something he didn't understand, then drew a small circle in the air with her finger. She did it again, slower this time, pointing toward the ground. Ethan frowned. "Circle?" he asked, tracing one on the table with his finger. Naya nodded quickly, then touched her heart. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering something like a prayer. Ethan sighed. He didn't know what she was trying to tell him, but he knew it wasn't simple fear. There was meaning in her gestures, something old, maybe sacred. After dinner, the wind picked up again. The fire crackled low in the cabin. Ethan sat at his desk writing in his journal, something he did whenever his thoughts were too heavy. He wrote about the girl, the footprints, and the unease that had followed her arrival. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he could feel a storm, not just of weather, so gathering close. Around midnight, he heard the horses outside grow restless again. Their nervous snorts carried through the still air. Ethan grabbed his lantern and stepped out. The snow was falling lightly, but the night was calm. He walked toward the corral, whispering to calm the horses. Then he saw it, a shape moving between the trees at the edge of the forest. He froze. It was tall, wrapped in fur, holding something long, maybe a spear or staff. The figure stood there watching him, unmoving. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if the wind itself had taken it away, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. Ethan stayed still, the lantern shaking slightly in his hand. His heart pounded, but there was no sound except the horses breathing. He looked around and saw nothing else, yet the feeling of being watched didn't fade. When he returned to the cabin, Naya was awake, sitting up near the fire. She looked frightened but not surprised. When he closed the door, she pointed toward the forest again and whispered something fast, almost pleading. Ethan shook his head. "It's all right," he said gently. "No one's going to hurt you," but she didn't look convinced. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window, as though she expected something to appear there. He sat near the fire, trying to calm his thoughts. He didn't know who the figure was or what it wanted, but deep inside he sensed that this was only the beginning. Outside, the wind shifted direction. The air felt warmer for a moment, and a faint smell of smoke drifted across the snow. Not from his fire, but from somewhere out in the woods. Ethan glanced at Naya, who had gone pale. She whispered a single word that he could barely hear, one that sounded like warning. And as the night fell completely silent, Ethan realized that something unseen was moving around them, something that would soon reveal itself in a way no man could forget. Night had fallen heavy over the valley, the sky hidden behind thick gray clouds. The wind carried the scent of ash, faint but real. Ethan sat by the window with his rifle beside him, staring into the darkness that pressed against the glass. The horses were restless again, stamping and snorting as if something unseen moved out there. He had checked the barn twice already, but it didn't calm his nerves. Every time the wind blew, he thought he saw a flicker of light in the distance, like a small fire starting and dying again. Inside the cabin, Naya sat close to the hearth, her small hands gripping the pouch at her neck. She hadn't spoken much all day, only a few broken words, but now her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed older than her years. She whispered something in her language, fast and breathless. Ethan didn't understand, but her trembling made the meaning clear. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, setting down his cup. She pointed toward the door, then drew another circle in the air, just like the night before. This time her hand shook. She whispered the same word again and again. It sounded like fire. Ethan frowned. "Fire, you mean outside?" She nodded quickly, then stood up and went to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she stared into the dark. Ethan joined her, squinting through the faint snowfall. For a long moment he saw nothing. Then a thin orange glow flickered far away near the ridge, small but steady. It wasn't lightning or a lantern. It was flame. Ethan's heart began to pound. He grabbed his coat and opened the door. The wind rushed in, biting cold, but he stepped out anyway. The air smelled heavier now, filled with smoke. He looked toward the ridge and saw not one, but several fires burning in a wide ring like lanterns placed in a pattern. The light danced across the snow, reflecting off the white ground. "What in the world?" he whispered. Behind him, Naya ran outside barefoot, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She called out in her language, her voice sharp and scared. Ethan turned to her, trying to calm her down, but she kept shouting toward the fire, tears streaming down her face. "Stay back, Naya," he said firmly. "You'll freeze!" But she didn't listen. She fell to her knees in the snow, pressing her hands together like she was praying. Her voice cracked with emotion, and Ethan realized she wasn't crying out for help. She was calling out to someone. He looked back at the fires. The flames had spread wider now, forming a circle around the ranch. Each one was placed perfectly apart from the other, burning clean and bright, not like normal campfires. There was no smoke rising straight up, only a glowing haze that shimmered above the snow. Ethan's first thought was that it had to be people, tribal men maybe, trying to send a warning or scare him. He reached for his rifle, his instincts pulling him toward defense. But something stopped him. There was no sound, no footsteps, no movement, no voices. Only the crackle of fire and the faint sound of the wind through the trees. Then he saw them. Figures began to appear just beyond the flames, their shapes faint in the dancing light. They stood still, motionless, like shadows given life. Ethan's breath caught. There were at least 10 of them, maybe more. He couldn't make out faces, only outlines painted in flickering orange. Each one held a torch and stood at equal distance, forming a wall of light around his land. Naya's voice broke the silence again. She was crying now, calling out words that sounded pleading, desperate. Ethan stepped toward her, not sure if he should pull her inside or stay still. The figures didn't move closer. They stood firm, the flames between them unbroken. Ethan took a few cautious steps forward, raising a hand. "Hey," he shouted into the cold. "You've no right to scare us like this." "Who are you?" No one answered. The flames only flickered harder as the wind rose. Then slowly, one of the figures lifted their torch higher. For a second, the light revealed part of a face, painted in ash and red clay. A man, old and calm, his eyes fixed on Ethan. He said something Ethan couldn't understand, a low chant that carried across the snow. The others joined him, their voices deep and rhythmic, like a single heartbeat in the night. Ethan froze. It wasn't a war cry. It wasn't anger. It sounded like a prayer. He turned to Naya, who was still kneeling. She looked up at him through tears and said in a broken whisper, "They protect." Ethan repeated, confused. "From what?" She shook her head and touched her chest, then the fire. "Evil," she said. "Follow me." From dark. The meaning hit Ethan slowly. She wasn't running from her tribe. She was running from something else, something her people believed followed her. And now they were trying to keep it away by surrounding the place with fire. Ethan lowered his rifle and looked around. The circle burned brighter now, glowing like the edge of the world. The snow between the fires began to melt, turning the ground into steaming patches. His horses neighed loudly, kicking against the stall doors. He wanted to run out and douse the flames, but something inside him stopped him. There was power in that fire, something that felt both sacred and dangerous. Minutes turned into hours. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, silent guardians in the light. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wind shifted again. The chanting faded, and one by one the torches were dropped into the snow. Each hissed softly as it went out. When the last one died, the valley returned to darkness. The people were gone. Ethan blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The fires left behind black rings in the snow, perfect and unbroken. The smell of burnt wood lingered. He turned to Naya, who was staring at the ground, her lips moving in silent prayer. He helped her stand. "They're gone now," he said quietly. She looked up at him with tired eyes. "Safe," she whispered. He wanted to believe her. But deep inside, he knew that what had happened wasn't over. It was only paused. The fire hadn't been an attack or a threat. It had been a warning and a wall. They went back inside, locking the door behind them. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but it still gave enough warmth to chase away the chill. Naya sat close to it, holding her pouch tight. Ethan sat beside her, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to steady his thoughts. "What was that, Naya?" he asked softly. "Who were they?" She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "My people. They make fire circle to stop shadow." Ethan frowned. "Shadow?" She nodded. "It follow. From burned village, I run. They stop it." Her voice trembled. She wasn't talking about soldiers or raiders. She spoke like she meant something unseen, something that lived in her fear. Ethan didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her it was just superstition, that there was no such thing as shadows that followed people. But as he looked out the window one last time, he saw the faint glow of embers still smoking on the snow. The fire circle hadn't broken, and for the first time since he came to this land, Ethan wasn't sure what to believe. He didn't see anything moving beyond the tree line, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. He sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet, watching the flames rise and fall. Naya finally fell asleep beside the fire, her face calm at last. Ethan looked at her and then at the door. Outside in the darkness beyond the circle, something shifted, a faint crunch of snow under an unseen footstep. Then silence. Ethan stared into the night until dawn touched the horizon, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the cold air. He didn't sleep at all that night. The first light of dawn touched the snow, turning it pale gold. Ethan Cole had not slept. His eyes were heavy, but his mind refused to rest. The strange circle of fire from the night before still burned in his thoughts like an image carved into stone. Outside, the ground was blackened where the flames had stood, forming a perfect ring around his camp. It looked unnatural, too exact to be made by chance. Naya was awake too. She sat by the window, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked calmer now, but there was a sadness in her eyes, like someone who knew that peace never lasted long. Ethan made coffee, the smell filling the cabin, and poured a cup for himself. When he offered one to her, she shook her head gently. "You should eat," he said. She didn't answer, only looked out toward the forest. After a moment, she whispered something soft in her language, a tone that sounded like a prayer. Ethan didn't understand, but he didn't interrupt. There was something sacred about the way she spoke, quiet but full of meaning. Later that morning, Ethan saddled his horse. "I'm going to see if anyone in town saw lights last night," he said, though he wasn't sure she understood. "You stay here, Naya, keep the door locked." But before he could step outside, she stood quickly and shook her head. "No, you no go," she said, her voice trembling. "They come," Ethan frowned. "Who comes?" She looked at him, her eyes wide and full of warning. "My people," he froze. "Your people?" She nodded, pointing toward the forest. "Elder come, talk, you wait." Ethan didn't know what to think. Part of him felt relief that there might be an explanation. Maybe he could finally understand the meaning of the fire circle. But another part of him worried what kind of men would walk into his land after what had happened. By noon, he heard the sound of hooves. He stepped outside, rifle resting loosely in his hand. A small group of riders was approaching slowly from the ridge. There were 5 of them, 4 younger men and 1 older man dressed in thick hides, his face marked with ash. He carried no weapon, only a carved staff with feathers tied near the top. Ethan didn't raise his rifle. He stood still as they dismounted. The old man walked forward while the others waited behind him. His expression was calm, almost solemn. When he reached the burned circle, he stopped and placed his hand on the ground. He whispered something in his tongue, then looked up at Ethan. Naya ran out from the cabin, calling something joyfully. She went down to her knees before the elder, bowing her head. The old man placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke softly. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but he could tell it was a greeting filled with care and relief. Then the elder turned to him. "You?" he said slowly, his accent thick but his tone respectful. "You find her?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, she was freezing near the creek. I brought her here, kept her safe." The elder studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good heart," he said. "But fire come because of her," Ethan frowned. "The fire circle? What was that about?" The old man walked closer, his boots crunching on the snow. "She run from north," he said. "Our land burn. Many spirits wake. She carry thing that must not fall into dark." He pointed to the pouch hanging around Naya's neck. She gripped it tightly as if afraid he might take it. The elder's eyes softened. "It protect," he said. "But when she cross the white land, spirits follow. Fire stopped them. Fire makes circle safe. Ethan tried to understand. You're saying the fire kept something away? The elder nodded. Yes, you see nothing, but it see you. Old anger walk with her. Fire make it stay out. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked at the ring of ashes around his ranch and remembered how perfect it had been, as if the fire itself had known where to burn. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Ethan said quietly. I just wanted to help. The old man smiled faintly. Help is never wrong. But when you help, you share her path. Ethan looked at Naya, who was still kneeling by the elder's side. What happens now? The elder turned toward her and spoke a few words. She answered softly, her eyes glistening. He nodded and then looked back at Ethan. She stay until sun come high 3 times, he said. Then we take her home. Fire must rest, then burn again to close path. Ethan didn't fully understand, but he accepted it. All right, he said. You can stay near the camp if you need to. The old man shook his head. We stay far. Fire line still strong. You safe. He paused, then added, take care of her. She carry light, but light call shadow. With that, he turned back toward his horse. The younger men followed without a word. In moments, they disappeared into the forest, leaving only the faint sound of hooves fading in the wind. Naya stood beside Ethan, watching them go. She looked calm but sad, like she knew something he didn't. He placed a hand on her shoulder. They said you'll stay here for 3 days, he said. You're safe now. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Safe. Not long, she said quietly. That night the air felt different again, too still, as if the world was holding its breath. The moonlight glowed faintly on the snow, reflecting the black ring where the fire had burned. Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat near the window, staring at the shadows outside. Sometimes he thought he saw shapes move just beyond the circle, too fast to be people, too quiet to be animals. He checked on Naya. She was asleep near the hearth, her hand still resting on the pouch. Her face was peaceful, but her body twitched like someone running in a dream. Ethan stepped outside for air. The cold bit deep, but he needed to clear his mind. The forest stood silent. He walked along the edge of the burned ring, each step crunching softly. The ashes glowed faintly under the moonlight, still warm in some places. He stopped and knelt down, touching the edge. The ground felt strange, dry and hot even though the snow around it was untouched. He frowned, brushing his hand over it. Suddenly a spark leaped from the ground, small but bright, burning for a second before vanishing. He stood quickly, his heart racing. The air around him seemed to shift, heavier somehow. He looked into the trees and saw nothing, but he could feel it. That same feeling from before. The sense that something unseen was watching from just beyond the light. He backed away slowly and went inside, bolting the door. When he turned, Naya was awake. She had seen his face and knew what he felt, you see? She whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. I saw something, he admitted. She looked at the fire and said, shadow angry. Fire weak now, he didn't know what to say. He only sat beside her, staring into the flames. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, almost like whispers moving through the night. Ethan had faced storms, wild animals, and nights alone in the open plains. But this silence filled with unseen movement, frightened him in a way he couldn't explain. The fire cracked, and for a brief second, it threw their shadows against the wall, one tall, one small. But behind them, for just a moment, a third shadow appeared, stretched long and strange before fading again. Neither of them spoke. They just sat there, listening to the wind and the soft beat of their own hearts, waiting for dawn to come. The morning light came slow, soft and gray. The snow around the ranch looked calm again, hiding all signs of the strange fire circle that had burned through the night before. Ethan Cole stepped outside, his breath white in the cold air. The world looked peaceful, but he could still feel the weight of what had happened. He turned his eyes toward the forest where the tribal elder and his riders had disappeared the day before. There was no sign of them now. Inside the cabin, Naya sat quietly near the fire. She was still holding her small pouch, the one her elder said carried protection. Her eyes followed Ethan as he came in, brushing the frost from his coat. She didn't speak at first. She only looked at him, as if waiting for him to say something she already knew. Did you sleep? He asked softly. She shook her head. Dream, she whispered. Fire talk. Ethan frowned slightly. What do you mean? She pointed to the window where the sun was climbing above the ridge. Fire say go home, she said in her slow, careful English. But shadow still come. You help me. It stop if I go. Her words made him uneasy. I don't want you to walk into danger, he said. If there's trouble waiting for you out there, we'll face it together. Naya's eyes filled with worry. No, she said quickly. If I stay, shadow stay. You kind man, but shadow no love kind. It burn all. Her voice was steady, but her fear was real. Ethan sat down on the chair across from her, thinking deeply. He wasn't a man who believed in old tales or curses, but the things he had seen here couldn't be denied. The circle of fire, the chanting, the warmth that came from burned ground. They were not tricks of the mind. Something had happened on this land, something beyond his understanding. Your elders said they would come for you, Ethan said finally. They'll protect you. She nodded slowly. They come today, she said. Before sunsleep. Ethan glanced out the window again, half expecting to see riders already on the horizon. The sky was quiet. The wind was low. Everything looked peaceful, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm that comes before a storm. He spent the morning fixing the fence, though his thoughts stayed on the girl in the cabin. Each time he looked back, he could see her small shape through the window, sitting still near the fire. When he finished his work and returned inside, he found her drawing shapes in the ash beside the hearth, circles, triangles, and small symbols. What are those? He asked gently. Marks, she said. For goodbye. Ethan sat beside her, watching her small hand move through the ash. You really think leaving will stop whatever's out there? She looked up at him. Her dark eyes were calm now, no longer filled with fear. Yes. Fire strong. People strong. Shadow only follow weak. I not weak now. Her words were simple but full of strength. Ethan nodded slowly. He felt something shift in his chest. Pride maybe, or sadness. He had lived alone for years, but this short time with her had filled the ranch with a kind of life he hadn't known he missed. When the sun reached its highest point, Naya stood and walked to the door. They come, she said. Ethan followed her outside. At first he saw nothing but the endless white of snow and the thin smoke from the chimney. Then, faintly in the distance, figures appeared, the same riders from before. The elder was at the front, his staff raised high. They moved slowly and with purpose, leaving clean tracks across the snow. When they reached the burned circle, they stopped. The elder dismounted and bowed his head to Ethan. You keep her safe, he said. For that, our people thank you. Ethan nodded respectfully. She's brave, he said. You should be proud. The elder smiled faintly. She learned courage from you, he said. Then he turned to Naya, speaking in his own language. His voice was soft, but his words carried power. She listened, then untied the pouch from her neck. She stepped toward Ethan and held it out with both hands. For you, she said. Protection. You need now. Ethan shook his head. I can't take that. It's yours. She smiled. A quiet, gentle smile. It choose you now, she said. Fire say so. He hesitated, then reached out and took it. The leather was warm, smooth, and light. Inside, something small shifted. A stone, maybe, or dried herbs. He closed his hand around it. Thank you, he said softly. Naya looked at him for a long moment, her eyes shining in the pale light. Then she turned and followed her people toward the forest. Ethan watched until the last rider disappeared into the trees. The wind picked up again, carrying the sound of distant chanting, low, steady, and peaceful. The ranch felt empty after they left. The air was still, and the silence pressed against the walls of the cabin. Ethan hung the pouch near the door, where the firelight could touch it. Days passed, and the strange heaviness around the ranch began to fade. The horses were calm again. The nights were quiet. For a while, it almost felt like life had returned to normal. But some nights, when the moon rose bright and full, Ethan would still smell smoke on the air, faint, like a memory. Once, when he walked to the edge of his land, he saw something that made him stop. The old circle of fire had returned, not burning this time but glowing softly under the snow, as if the earth remembered the heat. He didn't feel fear. He only felt respect. He knew now that some things weren't meant to be explained, only honored. A few weeks later, a letter came from town. A trader who spoke with the tribal elders brought word that Naya had reached her home safely. Her people had built a new village on the northern ridge. She had carried light for them once more, and no shadow had followed her this time. Ethan folded the letter and placed it on the shelf beside the small pouch. Every time he looked at it, he felt a strange peace in his heart. He didn't see Naya again, but he felt her presence in the quiet of the plains, in the whisper of the wind across the snow, in the faint smell of smoke that sometimes drifted through his open door. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Ethan stood outside watching the sky turn gold. The winter was ending, and spring would soon come to melt the last of the snow. He touched the pouch lightly, feeling the warmth of it against his palm. He thought of the night he found her, a shivering girl under a torn blanket, nearly lost to the cold. He remembered the circle of fire, the elder's calm voice, the chant that echoed through the valley. He remembered how fear had turned to faith, how silence had turned to trust. Sometimes when the fire in his cabin burned low, he would close his eyes and imagine her voice again, quiet but strong, saying, "It choose you now." And in that stillness, Ethan Cole understood what she had meant. The circle of fire had not just protected his land, it had changed him too. It had reminded him that kindness carries its own power, that sometimes the smallest act of mercy can light a fire that even darkness cannot cross. He smiled faintly, then turned toward the cabin. Behind him, the last rays of sunlight touched, the snow drawing a faint ring of gold around the ranch, a perfect circle fading slowly into the dusk. The wind rose once more, gentle and warm this time, carrying the scent of smoke and pine through the air. Ethan paused at the door, looked out one last time, and whispered to the horizon, "Safe travels, Naya." Then he went inside, closed the door softly, and let the fire burn bright into the night, the little pouch hanging near the light glowing faintly, a reminder that some miracles don't need to be seen to be believed.